A dusty garage in suburban Chicago. The air smells of grease and old metal. Daniel Brooks, a 41-year-old single father, is wiping oil from his hands when a sleek but broken-down car pulls in. A young woman, Victoria Hale, steps out. She's in a panic, desperate for a quick fix. After an hour of work, she realizes she's lost her wallet. "I'll pay you later," she stammers. Daniel just smiles. "Pay me when you're the boss," he says. She's stunned. She doesn't understand. But years later, a black limousine pulls up to that same humble garage, and that simple, forgotten promise finally changes everything forever. Daniel Brooks was a man of simple habits and deep convictions. At 41, his life revolved around two things: the rhythmic clinking of metal tools in his small Chicago garage, and the bright, gap-toothed smile of his 9-year-old daughter, Emma. He wasn't a rich man by any stretch of the imagination. His hands were permanently stained with the dark ink of engine oil, and his back often ached by the time the sun went down. But Daniel was content. He had once been a lead engineer at a major firm, a rising star in the world of high-end mechanics who could diagnose a complex engine failure just by listening to the vibrations. But when Emma's mother passed away, the corporate ladder felt more like a cage. He chose to leave the high-stress boardrooms and the six-figure salary all behind. He bought a small, aging garage just blocks away from Emma's school so he could be the one to pick her up every single afternoon. He traded prestige for presence, and he never regretted it for a single second. To Daniel, the garage wasn't just a place of work. It was a sanctuary of honesty. He knew every neighbor by their first name. He knew whose brakes were squeaky and whose engine needed a little extra prayer on cold mornings. He was the kind of man who would fix a bicycle for free because he knew the kids' parents were struggling, or spend extra hours on a veteran's truck without charging for the labor. He believed that a community was held together by these small, unrecorded acts of grace. On that particular Tuesday, the heat was shimmering off the asphalt outside, creating a hazy fog over the road. Daniel was buried deep under the hood of a rusted sedan when he heard the screech of tires. A luxury car, silver and gleaming despite the thick layer of road dust, limped into his lot. The engine was making a pathetic, rhythmic tapping sound. A woman stepped out, and she looked like she had just stepped off a movie set or out of a high-pressure boardroom. Victoria Hale was 26, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Daniel's entire tool collection. Her hair was perfectly styled, but her eyes were frantic. She was checking her watch every 10 seconds, her fingers tapping nervously against her expensive leather handbag. "I need this fixed. Now," she said, her voice tight with stress. "I have a meeting in the city that starts in 90 minutes. It's a make-or-break pitch. I'll pay whatever you want for the speed. Just get me back on the road." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and took a look. He saw the oil leaking onto the pristine engine block. It wasn't a catastrophic failure, just a loose belt and a sensor that had gone haywire. "It's not a big problem," Daniel said calmly, his voice a sharp contrast to her frenzied energy. "Give me an hour, I'll have you back on the road." As Daniel worked, Victoria sat on a greasy plastic chair in the corner of the garage. She was on her phone the entire time, her voice rising and falling as she argued with someone about market projections and quarterly reports. She sounded like someone fighting a war in a world where everyone was a traitor. Daniel could see the weight of the world on her shoulders. He thought of Emma, wondering if he ever wanted her to live a life that felt this heavy, this burdened by the expectations of others. When the job was done, Daniel wiped the hood of her car clean with a microfiber cloth. "All set," he announced. Victoria stood up, reaching for her bag. She dug through it, her movements becoming more and more frantic. She searched the side pockets. She searched the floor of the car. Then her face went deathly pale. I don't have my wallet," she whispered, her eyes wide with embarrassment. "I must have left it at the office in my other bag. I was in such a rush to get here. I am so sorry." She looked at him, expecting him to get angry. She expected a lecture, or for him to threaten to lock the car in the bay. Most people in this city didn't give anything for free, but Daniel just watched her. He saw the sweat on her forehead. He saw the desperation. He saw a young woman who was trying so hard to be something important that she had forgotten how to breathe. He remembered himself at that age, chasing shadows instead of substance. "I'll transfer the money," she said quickly. "I'll come back tomorrow. I promise. I'll pay you double for the trouble." Daniel leaned against his workbench. He looked at her polished suit and her trembling hands. He didn't see a rich client. He saw potential. He saw someone who was on the verge of a breakthrough, but needed a gentle push. He gave her a small, knowing smile. "Don't worry about it today," Daniel said. Victoria blinked, her confusion evident. "What?" "You're in a hurry to get to that meeting," Daniel said, opening the car door for her. "Go. Succeed. You can pay me when you're the boss." Victoria froze. She didn't understand the phrase. I am a boss," she stammered, trying to maintain her dignity. Daniel chuckled softly. "No, I mean when you're the person at the very top, the one who makes the rules. Until then, consider this an investment in your future." He didn't ask for her ID. He didn't ask for her phone number. He just let her go, watching the silver car disappear into the city haze. After she drove away, Daniel's co-worker, Pete, came out from the back. Pete was a cynical man who believed everyone was out to get them. "You're a fool, Dan," Pete muttered, shaking his head. "She's never coming back. That suit, that car, she probably does that at every garage in the state. You just gave away an hour of labor and $50 in parts for a thank you that doesn't pay the rent. You can't run a business on blind faith." Daniel didn't look up from his tools. "Maybe," he said softly. "Then why did you do it?" Pete asked. Daniel thought about Emma. He thought about the kind of world he wanted his daughter to grow up in. A world where people weren't just seen for their bank accounts, but for their journey. "Because," Daniel replied, "I choose to believe that some people just need someone else to tell them they're going to make it. And sometimes that's worth more than $50. It's worth a lifetime of confidence." Victoria Hale didn't just drive away, she flew. The silver car hummed perfectly as she sped toward the city skyline. But her mind was miles behind her, stuck in that small, grease-scented garage. "Pay me when you're the boss." The words echoed in her head like a heartbeat, vibrating through the steering wheel. Victoria wasn't a boss yet. Far from it. She was a senior associate in a cutthroat venture capital firm, a place where weakness was sniffed out like blood in the water and crushed instantly. That morning, she had been humiliated in front of the board. Her ideas had been dismissed as too idealistic. She had been told that she lacked the killer instinct needed to survive at the very top of the food chain. She had been driving to a final chance meeting with a difficult client, a meeting that would decide whether she was promoted or fired. The car breakdown had felt like a sign from the universe that she was a failure. And then she had met Daniel. Most men she worked with looked at her with either condescension or calculation. They saw a young woman who was too fast or too ambitious. But the mechanic, he had looked at her as if she had already won the race. He didn't see her panic as a weakness. He saw it as the friction before a successful launch. He hadn't judged her for losing her wallet. He had judged her for her future. As she walked into the high-rise office building, Victoria felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The stress that had been choking her all morning had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. During the meeting, when the client began to push back with aggressive tactics and loud demands, Victoria didn't crumble. She didn't get frantic. She remembered the mechanic's calm voice. She remembered the way he had fixed her car with precision and dignity in the middle of a heat wave. She spoke with a new kind of authority. She wasn't just trying to prove herself anymore. She was acting like the person Daniel thought she already was. By the end of the hour, she had secured the deal. Not just a small deal, the biggest contract the firm had seen in 3 years. She didn't celebrate with a drink. She celebrated with a deep, silent breath. As she left the office, her boss, a man who had never once complimented her in 3 years, stopped her in the hallway. "Good work today, Hale," he said, sounding genuinely surprised. "You were different. What changed? You had this aura of absolute certainty." Victoria smiled, her mind flashing back to the grease-stained walls of the garage. "I just realized I was worrying about the wrong thing," she said. She reached into her bag to find her phone and felt the small, greasy business card the mechanic had left on her dashboard. Brooks Automotive. She looked at it for a long time. She wanted to go back immediately and pay him. She wanted to show him that she was honest and that his faith wasn't misplaced. But then she remembered his specific instruction. Pay me when you're the boss. It wasn't a joke to him. It was a prophecy. He hadn't given her a free repair. He had given her a challenge. He had placed a bet on her life, and she wasn't going to let him lose. If she went back now and paid him the $100, she would be proving that she was just another customer passing through. But if she waited, if she actually became the person he predicted, that would be the real payment, the repayment of faith with achievement. Over the next few months, Victoria's life became a blur of work and strategy. But the killer instinct her colleagues talked about never quite fit her. Instead, she adopted Daniel's instinct. She treated her subordinates with respect. She looked for potential in the people others overlooked. She took risks on small startups that had greasy hands but big hearts. Every time she felt like giving up, every time a deal fell through or a board member tried to undermine her, she would look at that greasy business card in her drawer. She would remember the man who didn't even ask for her name before trusting her with his livelihood. He had seen the CEO in her when she only saw a failure. She realized that Daniel hadn't just fixed her car that day. He had fixed her vision. He had taught her that power isn't about what you can take from people. It's about what you can see in them. It's about being the person who believes when no one else does. She began to move up the ranks rapidly. Associate, vice president, senior partner. With every step, she became more of a boss, but she never felt like she had reached the finish line. She was waiting for the moment where she didn't just have the title, but the true authority to change lives on a massive scale. She often thought about the garage. She wondered if Daniel was still there, wiping oil from his hands. She wondered if he had forgotten about the silver car and the girl who lost her wallet. She worried that the garage might have closed or that he might have moved on to a different life. But she kept working. She kept climbing because she owed a debt that couldn't be paid with a checkbook. It could only be paid with the person she was becoming. 3 years passed, then 5, then 8. The city of Chicago changed. Skyscrapers grew taller. The world became faster, louder, and more digital. But for Daniel Brooks, life remained a steady rhythm of tools and family. Emma was no longer a little girl. She was a bright, ambitious 17-year-old preparing for college. She was his pride, his joy, and the reason he still woke up every morning with a smile, despite the growing arthritis in his hands. The garage had grown a little too. Daniel had managed to buy the lot next door, adding a second bay. But he was still the same man. He still wore the same faded blue jumpsuit. He still treated every customer like they were his only customer. He had become a local legend in the neighborhood, the man who would never overcharge you and would always listen to your stories. He had long forgotten the specific details of the young woman in the silver car. He remembered a fancy lady who had been in a rush, and he remembered the phrase he had used. It was a phrase he used often. Pay me when you're the boss. To Daniel, it was a way to remind people that their current struggles weren't their permanent destination. It was his way of sowing seeds of hope in a world that often felt barren. But for Victoria Hale, the memory of that day was as sharp as a diamond. She was now 34 years old. She had been through the fire. She had negotiated billion-dollar mergers. She had stood her ground against some of the most powerful men in the world. And finally, it happened. The firm's founder was retiring. The board of directors met for 3 days behind closed doors. There were many candidates, men with longer resumes and more aggressive reputations. But the board chose Victoria. They chose her because of her unique leadership style. They chose her because she was the only one who seemed to care about the human side of the numbers. On her first day as the official CEO of Hale and Associates, Victoria sat in her new office on the 81st floor. The view was breathtaking. The entire city of Chicago stretched out beneath her like a map. She looked at the polished mahogany desk, the expensive art on the walls, and the plaque that bore her new title. She opened the top drawer of her desk. Beneath a stack of legal documents sat a small plastic-covered piece of paper. It was a business card. The edges were frayed. The ink was faded. Brooks Automotive. She touched the card, and for a moment, she wasn't the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar firm. She was a 26-year-old girl with a broken car and a lost wallet, standing in a dusty garage feeling like a failure. She realized that her entire journey had been fueled by a stranger's faith. Every difficult decision she had made, every act of kindness she had shown to a struggling employee, it all led back to that 1 hour in the garage. She called her assistant. "Cancel my afternoon meetings," Victoria said, her voice clear and decisive. "Is everything okay, Ms. Hale?" the assistant asked, surprised. "You have the gala tonight and the press conference." "Everything is perfect," Victoria replied. "I just have an old debt to pay." She went down to the parking garage. Her driver was waiting by the black limousine. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked, opening the door. Victoria gave him an address in a part of the city the limousine rarely visited. As they drove away from the gleaming glass towers and toward the suburban outskirts, Victoria felt a flutter of nervous excitement in her chest. She looked at her reflection in the window. She looked older, more confident, more powerful. But she wondered if Daniel would recognize the girl behind the success. She wondered if he would even remember her. The neighborhood started to look familiar. The cracked sidewalks, the small corner stores. And then she saw it. The sign was newer, but the building was the same. Brooks Automotive. The limousine slowed to a crawl as it turned into the gravel lot. The sight of the long black car was out of place among the rusted pickup trucks and old sedans. People on the sidewalk stopped to stare. A group of teenagers on bikes hovered nearby, their eyes wide. Inside the garage, Daniel was working on a brake line. He heard the crunch of gravel and the heavy, expensive sound of a high-end engine. He wiped his hands on his rag and stepped out into the light, squinting against the sun. He saw the limousine. He saw the driver step out and open the rear door. And then he saw her. She was different. Her hair was a different style. Her clothes were even more expensive. But her eyes, they were the same. They were the eyes of someone who had found her way. Victoria stepped onto the gravel, her high heels clicking softly. She walked toward the man in the blue jumpsuit who was standing there, looking a little confused and a lot older. She stopped 3 feet away from him. She didn't say hello. She didn't introduce herself. She just reached into her pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and held it out to him. "I believe I owe you this," she said, her voice steady but warm. "Plus interest." Daniel looked at the money, then at her face. A slow, wide smile began to spread across his weathered face. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "Well," Daniel said softly, his voice full of pride, "I guess you made it." The gravel lot of Brooks Automotive was silent as the two of them stood there. The black limousine sat behind Victoria like a silent witness to her journey. Daniel didn't take the money immediately. Instead, he looked at Victoria with a fatherly kind of pride, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You've been carrying that for a long time, haven't you?" Daniel asked. Victoria nodded, her eyes glistening. 8 years. Every single day. Every time I had to make a choice. Every time I wanted to give up. I thought about what you said. I thought about the man who didn't even know my name, but told me I would be the boss. Daniel finally took the bill, but he didn't put it in his pocket. He looked at it as if it were a trophy. "You know, Victoria, I've said that to a lot of people over the years, but you're the first one who came back in a limo." Victoria laughed, a sound of pure relief. "I wanted to come back sooner. I wanted to show you I was honest, but I realized that the only way to truly pay you back was to prove you were right. I had to become the person you saw that day." Daniel motioned toward the small office in the corner of the garage. "Come in, please. Emma is in the back doing her homework. I want her to meet the woman who turned my favorite line into a reality." As they walked into the small, air-conditioned office, the contrast was striking. Victoria, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire, sat on the same squeaky plastic chair she had occupied 8 years ago. The smell of old coffee and engine oil was the same. The calendars on the wall were different, but the heart of the place hadn't changed at all. Daniel introduced her to Emma. The teenager's eyes went wide when she realized who was sitting in her father's office. Victoria talked to them for an hour. She didn't talk about her stocks or her mergers. She talked about the struggle. She talked about the fear of failing. She talked about how one sentence, spoken in a moment of kindness, had become the foundation of her entire career. Most people, Victoria said, looking at Emma, only see who you are right now. They see your mistakes, your panic, your empty wallet. But your father, he has a gift. He sees who you could be, and sometimes that's the only thing that keeps you going. Daniel looked down at his oil-stained hands, humbled. I just fix what's broken, Victoria. Sometimes it's a car, sometimes it's just a person's spirit. Before she left, Victoria handed Daniel a second envelope. This one was much thicker. What's this? Daniel asked, his brow furrowing. It's not a gift, Victoria said firmly. It's an investment. I'm starting a foundation for young entrepreneurs from this neighborhood, and I want Brooks Automotive to be the official partner for our logistics and fleet maintenance. This is the down payment for the contract. Daniel looked at the envelope, then at his daughter. He knew what this meant. It meant Emma's college was paid for. It meant the garage was safe forever. It meant his investment in a stranger 8 years ago had returned 1,000-fold. He looked at Victoria, his eyes moist. I told you to pay me when you were the boss. I didn't expect you to hire me. Victoria smiled and hugged him. A good boss knows when to hire the best talent, and you, Daniel, are the best there is. As Victoria stepped back into her limousine and drove away, she looked out the rear window at the small garage fading into the distance. She felt a weight lift off her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The debt was paid, but the connection was just beginning. She realized that the world is built on these tiny, invisible threads of faith. Every day we have the choice to either judge someone for their current state or to speak life into their future. Daniel Brooks had no reason to trust her that day. He had every reason to be cynical, to be angry, or to be indifferent, but he chose kindness. That one act of kindness didn't just fix a car, it created a CEO. It saved a foundation. It changed a neighborhood. Daniel stood in his lot, holding the $100 bill. He didn't see it as money anymore. He saw it as a reminder that hope is the most powerful tool in the world. He turned to Emma, who was still staring at the spot where the limo had been. Remember this, Emma, Daniel said softly. Never judge a book by its cover, especially when the cover's a little torn, because you never know when you're looking at a legend in the making. Emma nodded, her eyes bright with a new kind of understanding. In a world that often feels cold and transactional, where every favor comes with a price tag, Daniel and Victoria proved that the best things in life are given without expectation. Daniel went back into the garage and picked up his wrench. There was a new sound in his movements, a lightness, a joy. He wasn't just fixing cars anymore. He was building a legacy. And somewhere in the city, Victoria Hale sat in her high-rise office, looking at the city skyline. She was still the boss. She still had the power and the money, but now she had something even better. She had the peace of knowing that she had honored the man who saw the CEO in a girl with a broken car. Sometimes the simplest words are the ones that stay with us the longest. They become the fuel for our journey. They become the light in our darkest hours. Pay me when you're the boss. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a life-changing promise. Sometimes a simple sentence can become the very thing someone carries with them throughout their entire journey. Choose your words wisely. They have the power to build futures. If you believe a few words can change someone's path, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me, what's one sentence that stayed with you forever?